It was the second Monday of October, Thanksgiving, and I had spent most of the morning in the kitchen the way I always did when the family was coming over. The turkey had been in the oven since 7. I made the stuffing from scratch, the same recipe my wife Margaret used every year before she passed. With celery and sage and a handful of dried cranberries she always insisted on adding. I set the table with the good dishes, the white ones with the blue rim that we bought together at a little shop in Prince Edward County on our 25th anniversary. I even ironed the cloth napkins, which I never do for myself, only for them. My eldest son and his wife arrived first, pulling into the driveway in the new Range Rover he had mentioned 3 times on our last phone call. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with his mother's eyes and none of her patience. My younger son came 20 minutes later with my daughter-in-law and the 2 grandchildren, 9 and 11 years old, who immediately asked if the Wi-Fi password was still the same. It was. I smiled and told them where the remote was. We sat down at 2:30. I poured the wine, carved the turkey, passed the mashed potatoes, and listened to them talk. They talked about a lot of things. My eldest son talked about a bonus he was expecting at year-end. My younger son talked about a property he and his wife were thinking of buying in Mississauga. Something with a finished basement and good school ratings. My daughter-in-law talked about a wellness retreat she was planning for January. The grandchildren said almost nothing and ate quickly so they could get back to their tablets. I listened the way I always listened, quietly, asking the occasional question, nodding in the right places. It was after the pie that things shifted. My eldest son leaned back in his chair, the way men do when they feel fully in control of a room, and said, "Dad, you know we've been thinking about your situation." He said the word situation the way a doctor says complication, carefully, like it was a diagnosis he had been rehearsing. My younger son straightened up. His wife picked up her wine glass but didn't drink from it. I asked what he meant. "You're 68, my eldest son said. "This house is getting to be a lot for one person. The maintenance alone. And the drive to get anywhere from here? You mentioned the knee is acting up again." "The knee is fine," I said. "Dad." He said it gently. "The way you talk to someone who is not quite following the conversation. We just want to make sure you're set up properly, before things get harder." My younger son slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed pages, glossy, full of photographs of cheerful-looking common rooms and organized activity schedules. Retirement residences, 3 of them, all in the Hamilton area. One was called Sunrise Gardens. The monthly rate was listed at the bottom in small print, $4,200 for a basic room. They had already done the math on what my Canada pension plan and old age security payments would cover and what gap would remain. The gap was significant. They had a plan for that too, the house. "We had it appraised," my eldest son said. "Not officially, just a friend in real estate who took a look. He thinks somewhere around $850, maybe $900 if we wait until spring. With the mortgage paid off, that gives you a comfortable buffer. More than enough. And we'd each contribute a little monthly," my younger son added. "It wouldn't be a burden. It would just be organized." A burden. That word landed somewhere in the middle of my chest and stayed there. I looked around the table. My daughter-in-law was nodding. The grandchildren had already left the room. My eldest son was looking at me with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression he used at my wife's funeral when he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll take care of everything, Dad." At the time, I had believed him. I picked up one of the brochures. Sunrise Gardens. The activity schedule listed bingo on Tuesdays, chair yoga on Thursdays, and a movie afternoon every other Sunday. The dining room photograph showed round tables with 4 seats each, half of them occupied by people sitting very still and looking at nothing in particular. I set the brochure down. "Let me think about it," I said. My eldest son nodded, clearly relieved that I hadn't argued. "Of course. No rush. We just want you to know we've been thinking about you." After they left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the Range Rover back out of the driveway. The street was quiet, the way suburban streets get quiet on holiday evenings, that particular Canadian autumn silence of raked leaves and closed garage doors. I stood there for a while. Then I went to the basement, poured myself 2 fingers of scotch, and sat in the chair I keep next to the furnace, for exactly the kind of evening when I need to think without being seen doing it. I thought about the folder, about the appraisal they had arranged without telling me, about the gap they had already calculated, about the word burden. Then I picked up my phone and called Martin. Martin has been my lawyer for 22 years. He is also one of the few people in my life who has never once looked at me the way my sons looked at me over the Thanksgiving table. He answered on the second ring, which he always does, regardless of the hour. "Gerald," he said. "Happy Thanksgiving." "Martin," I said. "I need you to pull the employment files for both of my sons. And I need the last 12 months of expense reports from the Northern Division." A pause. "Did something happen?" "Something happened," I said. "I'll explain tomorrow. What I need to explain, before any of this makes sense, is who I am. Not the version of me my sons have always known, but the actual version. My sons know me as a widowed, retired man who lives in a 3-bedroom bungalow in Burlington, Ontario, drives a 2016 Honda CR-V, and spends his time gardening, watching the Leafs lose, and occasionally complaining about the price of groceries at the Fortinos near the house. They know I worked in property management for most of my career. They know I have a modest pension and some savings. They know I sometimes need help understanding my online banking, or at least I tell them I do. What they have never known, because I chose not to tell them, is that I founded Lakeside Care Group in 1998 with a single long-term care home in Barrie, and spent the next 25 years turning it into a network of 11 facilities across Ontario, employing over 900 people, with annual revenues that would surprise most people who have ever shared a holiday table with me. My wife Margaret knew. She was my partner in every real sense of the word, which is why the months after she died were the hardest of my professional life as well as my personal one. I made a decision in that period, the kind of decision that grief makes seem logical, that I would protect my sons from what I had watched easy money do to other families. I had seen it in the industry. Children who knew their parents were wealthy stopped working hard, started expecting, started treating the future as something they were owed. I did not want that for my sons. I wanted them to build something of their own. What I did not fully account for was what would happen if they built something on a foundation I had quietly arranged. Both of my sons work in healthcare administration. My eldest son is a regional director at a company called Meridian Health Services, which manages several long-term care facilities in the Greater Toronto Area. My younger son is a financial controller at the same company. They got their positions through their own applications and their own qualifications, which are genuine. What they do not know is that Meridian Health Services is a subsidiary of a holding company that Lakeside Care Group acquired 6 years ago in a quiet deal that Martin managed, and that generated very little public attention. Their employer, in every practical sense, reports to me. I found this out myself 3 years after the acquisition, when I was reviewing an organizational chart and noticed the names. I chose not to say anything. At the time, it seemed like an interesting coincidence. After Thanksgiving, it felt like an opportunity. Martin came to the house the following morning with 2 coffees from the Tim Hortons on Brant Street, a medium double-double for me and a black for himself, which he has ordered the same way for as long as I have known him. We sat at the kitchen table, the good dishes put away, the brochures still in the folder by the door where I had left them the night before. I told him about the dinner, about the folder, about the appraisal, about the gap and the plan. Martin is not an expressive man. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I have kept him as my lawyer for 22 years. "They want to sell the house," he said, when I had finished. "By spring," I said. He looked at the folder. "And they've made no mention of wanting you closer to them, just managed more efficiently." "Organized," I said. "Their word." He nodded slowly. "What do you want to do?" I told him I wanted the employment files first. Everything. Performance reviews, attendance records, expense submissions, anything that could be accessed without raising questions through the normal channels of a corporate audit. Martin said he would have it within 48 hours. He also said, for the 4th or 5th time over the years, that he thought I should simply tell them the truth. I thanked him for the coffee and walked him to the door. The files arrived Thursday evening, sent encrypted to the private email account I maintain under the name of the holding company, which is not Gerald Whitmore, the man my sons know, but G.W. Capital Holdings Incorporated, the entity that owns Lakeside Care Group, which owns the company that signs their paychecks. I sat at the desk in the spare room, the one I use for actual work and keep locked, and I read. My eldest son's attendance record was the first thing that gave me pause. As a regional director, his contract required him to be present at a minimum of 3 facilities per week, with documented site visits. In the previous 6 months, he had completed those visits on approximately 40% of the weeks scheduled. The remaining weeks showed administrative notes, logged remotely, submitted on days when the building access records showed he had not badged in anywhere. Someone in his position, at his level, could arrange that. It took a certain kind of comfortable confidence. His expense account showed meals claimed as client entertainment at restaurants I recognized, not because I am particularly familiar with upscale Toronto dining, but because Martin had mentioned one of them during a conversation about a deal we had both attended. The amounts were not catastrophic, but the pattern was. 14 consecutive months of entertainment claims that slightly exceeded the company policy ceiling, each one just under the threshold that would trigger automatic review. Not a mistake, a calculation. My younger son's file was less dramatic, but in some ways more disappointing. He was a financial controller. Numbers were his profession. And yet there were recurring discrepancies in the Southern Division's quarterly reports, small rounding adjustments that individually meant nothing but collectively, over 18 months, had redirected a modest amount of vendor credit into a discretionary budget line that my younger son personally authorized. Martin confirmed it when I called him Friday morning. Not fraud in the criminal sense, he said carefully, but not clean either. I sat with all of this for the weekend. On Sunday, I drove out to one of the lakeside facilities, a home in Ancaster I had not visited in several months. I went as I always go, quietly, without announcement, in the CRV, with the mud still on the wheel wells from the gravel lane behind my house. The director of care, a woman named Patricia, who has worked with us for 9 years, greeted me at the front desk with her usual efficiency and walked me through the building. We passed the common room where a group of residents were watching a hockey game. An older man near the window was by himself, facing the glass rather than the screen. He was wearing a blue cardigan that was slightly too large for him, the way clothes get when a person loses weight in old age. He was not watching anything. He was just present, the way people are present when no one is coming and they have stopped expecting anyone to. Patricia followed my gaze. "Mr. Arsenault," she said quietly. "His son lives in Calgary. We haven't had a visitor for him since February." I stayed at the window for a moment. Then I drove home and called Martin again. "I want to call a governance review," I told him. "Full audit of Meridian Health Services. Flag it as a routine compliance process. I want it to feel ordinary until it isn't." "Gerald," Martin said. "I know what I'm doing, Martin. I'm not questioning what you're doing. I'm asking if you've thought about what comes after." I told him I had thought about very little else since Monday. The audit was initiated through proper channels the following week. A governance review at a subsidiary level, routed through the holding company, required no special authorization from Meridian's internal leadership. It was, as I had asked, routine in appearance. The compliance team that conducted it was one I had worked with for years, and they understood the assignment without needing it explained. In the meantime, I continued behaving exactly as I always had. My eldest son called on Wednesday to check in, which he does approximately twice a month. I told him my knee was feeling better and that I had looked at the Sunrise Gardens brochure and found the chair yoga quite appealing. He said that was great, Dad, and that he would set up a tour for November. I said that sounded fine. My younger son texted to ask if I had eaten properly over the weekend, which is a question he asks occasionally to demonstrate concern without requiring a response that involves any effort on his part. I texted back that I had made a big pot of soup and it had lasted 3 days. He sent a thumbs-up emoji. I went about my regular week. I drove to the nursery on Dundas and bought some late-season garlic to put in before the ground hardened. I had coffee with a neighbor. I watched the Leafs lose to the Jets in overtime. I did not sleep particularly well, but I had not slept well since October. The compliance report arrived in my inbox on the 1st of November. It confirmed what the preliminary files had suggested and added several things I had not known. My eldest son had, over the past 2 years, used his regional director status to approve staffing contracts with a company that, when traced back through its registration, was associated with a personal contact of his, a man who had been his college roommate and who operated a casual labor placement service. The contracts were not fraudulent in a way that would have been caught easily, but they represented a conflict of interest that any director of his seniority should have identified and disclosed. He had not disclosed it. The staffing costs under those contracts ran approximately 11% above market rate. My younger son's budget discrepancies were confirmed and quantified. Not a large number in the context of a company our size, but sufficient and, more importantly, deliberate. Martin reviewed the report and called me on the evening of November 3rd. "This is enough," he said. "If these were any other employees, this would have concluded weeks ago." "I know," I said. "So what's the timing?" I asked him to book the boardroom at our downtown Toronto office for November 15th. I told him to send the meeting invitation through the holding company's executive coordinator, not through Meridian, to title it simply as a governance meeting. My sons would receive it as any senior Meridian staff would receive a meeting summons from the parent company. Routine, professional, unfamiliar. I told Martin to tell no one else. And then I told him one more thing. I needed him to make a call on my behalf to a designer I had worked with years ago, because I was going to need a new suit. I had not worn the dark charcoal suit since a board presentation in 2019. It still fit. My assistant, Caroline, who manages the operational side of Lakeside from an office in Barrie, and who has worked with me for 16 years, had arranged for my credentials to be updated, my parking validated, and the boardroom set with 3 chairs on one side of the table and one on the other. I arrived at the building on Bay Street at 8:45. The lobby had that particular Toronto Financial District energy, all marble and controlled movement and coffee cups from places that charge $6 for a medium. I took the elevator to the 14th floor. Caroline was already there. She handed me a folder, gave me the same look Martin had given me the night before, which is the look of someone who respects you enough not to talk you out of your decisions, and went to her desk. I sat in the boardroom alone for 12 minutes. Then Caroline's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Whitmore, they've arrived. Send them in." The door opened, and my eldest son walked in first, which is his habit. He was wearing his good suit, the one he wore to his mother's funeral, which told me he had done some research into who G.W. Capital Holdings was and had dressed accordingly. My younger son was behind him, slightly less certain of himself, with the look of a man who was not sure whether to be concerned or merely inconvenienced. They were talking to each other as they came through the door, something low and quick, a professional reassurance of some kind. Then my eldest son looked up. He stopped walking. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds, which is a very long time when nothing is moving. "Dad," he said. It came out as a question. "Please sit down," I said. Neither of them sat immediately. My younger son looked at his brother, then back at me, and I watched his face move through several expressions very quickly: surprise, confusion, and then a particular kind of stillness that happens when the brain is working very fast and the face has not yet caught up. I waited. They sat. "I imagine this is not the meeting you were expecting," I said. My eldest son found his voice first. He has always been the faster one in that regard. "Dad, what is this?" "This," I said, opening the folder in front of me, "is a governance review meeting. I am Gerald Whitmore, founder and controlling shareholder of G.W. Capital Holdings Incorporated, which is the parent company of Lakeside Care Group, which acquired Meridian Health Services in 2018. Your employer, to be precise, reports to me." My younger son made a sound that was not quite a word. "I've spent the last month reviewing a compliance report commissioned by our governance office," I continued. "The report covers several areas of concern at the Meridian level. I'd like to go through them with you." "Dad," my eldest son said again, but differently this time. "In this room," I said, and my voice was the same voice I have used in boardrooms for 25 years, steady and without anger. "You can address me as Gerald or as Mr. Whitmore. We'll keep this professional." My eldest son looked at me for a long moment. Then he straightened in his chair and pressed his lips together and became, visibly, the regional director, rather than the son. I had seen him learn to do that. That particular ability to shift registers. And I had always admired it, even when I was pretending not to understand what a regional director was. I opened the first section of the report. "In your capacity as regional director," I said, "you approved 6 staffing contracts with a placement company called ClearPath Labor Solutions over a period of 22 months. Can you tell me about your relationship to the owner of that company?" He was quiet. "We have his contact information on file," I said. "We have your phone records from the company mobile account. We have the registration documents for ClearPath, which list his name. I'm giving you an opportunity to explain the context before I ask you to explain why none of this was disclosed." My eldest son looked at his hands. "He's a friend," he said finally. "He needed business. I thought his rates were competitive." "They were 11% above market," I said, "and you were the sole approver on the contracts. Company policy requires dual authorization for vendor agreements above $50,000 annually. Were you unaware of that policy?" He stopped. "I thought it was a different threshold." "You've been a regional director for 4 years," I said. "The policy has not changed in that time." I turned to my younger son. The numbers were harder to sit through, because my younger son is genuinely good with numbers, and that made the choices he had made more deliberate rather than less. I watched him listen to the breakdown. His face went very still in a way that reminded me of my wife when she was deciding something difficult. That same quality of inward concentration, except in this case the decision had already been made, and what he was concentrating on was how to exist in the aftermath of it. When I finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then my eldest son said, "How long have you known about who you are? What this company is?" "I founded Lakeside in 1998, I said. "I have known who I am for quite a long time." "No," he shook his head. "How long have you known we worked here?" "I noticed your names on an org chart approximately 3 years after the acquisition," I said. "At that point, I made a decision to observe rather than intervene. I believed you deserved the opportunity to demonstrate who you were without my involvement." My younger son made a sound, not quite a laugh, something smaller and more painful than a laugh. And, I said, "you demonstrated exactly who you were." The silence that followed was different from the first one. That silence had been shock. This one was the sound of 2 men understanding something that could not be understood. My eldest son said, "The Thanksgiving dinner. You knew then too." "I knew before Thanksgiving," I said. "The compliance process had been ongoing for several weeks. What happened at Thanksgiving informed my decision about timing." "The brochures," he said. "The brochures," I confirmed. He put his hands flat on the table. "Dad, those were we were trying to help you." I looked at him. I have loved this man since the night he was born, when he was red and furious and louder than I expected, and the doctor handed him to me, wrapped in a blanket, and I did not know yet all the ways you could fail someone simply by loving them imperfectly. I looked at him, and I thought about the folder he had slid across my Thanksgiving table, and the appraisal they had arranged without telling me, and the gap they had calculated, and the activity schedule at Sunrise Gardens with its bingo Tuesdays and its chair yoga Thursdays, and the man in the blue cardigan at Ancaster, who had not had a visitor since February. "You were trying to solve a problem," I said. "I understand the difference." I took 3 envelopes from the folder and placed them on the table. "These are formal notices of termination from Meridian Health Services," I said. "The grounds are documented conflict of interest in one case and financial policy violations in the other. You are entitled to independent legal advice before signing the acknowledgement forms inside. Human Resources will be in contact within 48 hours to discuss the details of your departure. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings today." My younger son looked at the envelope like it was something that had arrived from a country he had never heard of. "You're actually firing us," he said. "Yes," I said. "We're your sons." "You are," I said. You are also employees of a company that has policies and standards that exist because 900 other people depend on this organization to function properly. When I have dismissed people in the past for violations of similar severity, I did not make exceptions based on personal relationships. I am not going to start making that exception now because it happens to be inconvenient. My eldest son was very quiet. What happens to us? That, I said, is entirely up to you. You are both qualified professionals. My eldest son, you have a genuine talent for operations. I have watched your reports for 3 years, and when you apply yourself, the work is good. What you have never learned is that talent does not entitle you to a different set of rules than everyone else. Learning that, genuinely learning it rather than simply saying it, may take some time. I hope you use that time well. I turned to my younger son. Your technical skills are strong. Your judgment has been poor. Those are not the same problem, and they have different solutions. I stood. My eldest son looked up. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. Did you ever plan to tell us about any of it? I thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. I planned to tell your mother, I said. We talked about it once or twice over the years. She thought I was wrong to keep it from you. She thought you would have handled it better than I gave you credit for. I paused. I think she may have been right about that. I was trying to give you something and I gave you the wrong thing. That is my part of this, but it does not change yours. They left with the security escort. I stayed at the window and watched the street below for a while. The ordinary November afternoon of Bay Street. The pedestrians with their coats done up against the cold, the delivery trucks double parked, the ordinary continuing business of a city that had no idea what had just happened on the 14th floor. Martin came in when they were gone and stood beside me. How do you feel? He asked. Like a man who just fired his sons, I said. And like a man who possibly should have had a very different conversation a very long time ago. I picked up my coffee, which had gone cold. Don't say you told me so. I would never, Martin said, and poured the cold coffee down the boardroom sink. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way I had not anticipated. Not peaceful exactly. Quiet the way a house is quiet after you have finally fixed the furnace and can no longer hear the noise it was making. A noise you had grown so accustomed to that you stopped noticing it was there. My eldest son called 3 weeks after the meeting. Not to argue. He called to tell me that he had retained a lawyer, reviewed the documentation, and decided not to contest the termination. He said that his wife had found out about the staffing arrangement and that their conversations since then had been difficult. He said he was not calling to ask for anything. He said he was calling because he had not slept properly since November, and he needed to say out loud that he was sorry, not for getting caught, but for the Thanksgiving table, for the folder, for a series of smaller moments he had been cataloging in the weeks since, moments in which he had treated me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. I listened without interrupting, the way Martin always listens to me. When he finished, I said, "Thank you for calling." "That's all?" he said. "For now," I said. "Yes." My younger son took longer. He went back to basics, which is his nature. He took a contract position at a smaller accounting firm and spent 6 months demonstrating that he could produce reliable work without a comfortable institutional structure holding him up. When he eventually called, it was to ask if we could have coffee. Not to discuss business, just coffee. We met at a Tim Hortons on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriately ordinary, and talked for an hour and a half about nothing that was on either of our minds, but gradually, around the edges, about things that were, progress is not a door that opens. It is more like the light changing in November, so gradually that you cannot identify the moment it started, but you can eventually tell that something is different. I sold the bungalow in the spring, not because anyone suggested it, but because it was the right time. It was too quiet in the evenings, and Margaret's absence had a particular weight in that house that I carried differently elsewhere. I bought a condominium on the escarpment, with a view of the lake that she would have loved, and I think about her whenever the light is right on the water. The grandchildren still ask for the Wi-Fi password when they come over. It is a different password now, but the habit is the same. My youngest grandchild, the 11-year-old who is now 13, asked me recently what I did for work. It was the first time any of the grandchildren had asked me a direct question about my life. I told her I worked in long-term care. I told her I had started with one building in Barrie and worked for a long time to make something out of it. She asked if it was hard. I said some of it was hard. Yes. She asked if it was worth it. I thought about the man in the blue cardigan at Ancaster. I thought about the woman in the Sunrise Gardens brochure with her chair yoga on Thursdays. I thought about 900 employees who show up because the organization works, because someone built something that functions even when no one is watching. Yes, I told her. It was worth it. She nodded, as if this was a reasonable answer, and then went back to her tablet, and I sat with my coffee and looked out at the lake. I am 69 years old. I have made mistakes that I cannot take back and decisions that I would not change and a life that is genuinely and entirely my own. I have sons who are better at being themselves than they were a year ago, which is not the same as having the relationship I once imagined we would have, but it is honest in a way that the old version was not. Honest is what I have, and it turns out that is more than enough. If you are watching this and you recognize something in this story, something in the way a family can go quiet and polite around the things that actually matter, I want you to hear this. You do not owe your silence to anyone. Not to keep the peace, not to avoid the conversation, not to protect people from truths they have earned. You deserve to be known as you actually are. Not the version of you that is easy to manage, not the version that fits into someone else's plan. The actual version, complicated and capable and worthy of every room you walk into. This is Subtle Vengeance. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And remember, being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you agree to stay that way.